Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 28th, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer joins us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you, Nima. Good to be back.
Let me start, John, with please subscribe and hit like button before we start. And I want to start, John, with the latest news on the Russian part, which was the new missile. It's called Burevestnik, and this new missile is nuclear powered missile.
Hmm.
But looking at the way that the Russian president was talking about it, it seems to me that he's trying to show the West that he's prepared for any sort of escalation if they want to go in that direction. Your
Well,
take on that. What was the message in your opinion, if there was some?
the important thing was the location and the stress that President Putin made on the briefing at a joint army group command post with General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. The important thing was on Sunday to demonstrate um, the political and military progress of the war and the extent to which the Russian side wanted understood that the advance now involves a series of encirclements up and down the contact line, which threaten a breakthrough at any point and the destruction of very large numbers of Ukrainian forces and the collapse of their capability to move reserves. They're running out of reserve. That was the important point. Exactly why Burevestnik, the long range or unlimited range nuclear powered missile and potentially nuclear armed cruise missile, was mentioned, is less than clear. 2 points. One is what Putin said. The second thing is the very strange behavior and statement of his spokesman 24 hours later. On the one hand, Putin made the point, as did General Gerasimov in their question and answer, that what has been tested to the point where the missile can now become operational and assigned to combat units is that it's very long range, that it's operates at a speed of approximately 1,200 kilometers an hour. It can maneuver in such a way as to approach from one apparent direction and then change direction abruptly. And finally, that it can loiter. Now, those characteristics, and you have others who are ex-military men who can talk about this more credibly and expertly than I can. The characteristics are essentially those in which the Russian side is saying, look, Mr. President, President Trump, that is, we have a weapon against which you don't have and will not have a defense. And there is nothing like this available in your arsenal. When Putin has said this in the past, the Burevestnik has been identified in earlier Putin speeches, especially the so-called State of the Union or Address to the Federal Assembly speech, which President Putin gave at the end of February 2024. He always associated it with the Russian wish to engage actively in new strategic arms limitation talks, and made it appear as if the deployment of the Burevestnik might be a negotiating chip on the table, which were the US to come to talks and agree on new START limitations, the Burevestnik would be removed. Now, that was said in 2024, and President Putin said it again on Sunday when he said, and I'm looking down at my notes to get you the right exact words, he said, we're going to have to decide we will need, I'm quoting Putin, we will need to determine which class of weapons this new system belongs to, identify possible modes of employment, and begin preparing the infrastructure to base it in our armed forces. In other words, we're getting ready to deploy, but we have to determine, is it a strategic or tactical weapon because of its unlimited range, and so forth. Essentially, it's another appeal to the United States to reopen the START talks. And it's another appeal over the statement that Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin has made, that there has been no movement by the United States towards Russia on either the new START talks, which were due to expire very shortly, January 2026, and President Putin sought to extend for another year. So in a sense, it's a warning to the United States, why aren't you opening the new strategic arms limitation talks? The second thing that happened, it's quite odd, is that 24 hours after Putin's statement, Dmitry Peskov seemed to undercut him. What Peskov said was, and I'm looking again down at my notes so I get you the right quotes Peskov, there's nothing here that could or should further strain relations between Moscow and Washington, especially since they are already at a minimum. So far, only the first tentative steps have been taken to bring these relations out of their previous state of stagnation. A bit ambiguous, I grant you. Realistic, yes, that's the state of current US-Russian negotiations on all fronts. The Ukraine war, the strategic arms limitation, the revival of diplomatic relations between the State Department and Russia. That's true. But he seemed to be responding to American criticism that Putin had been saber-rattling by saying, don't worry about it. It's not so serious. By then, President Trump had said, and I can read you what he said. It's interesting and it's different. Quotes, they know we have a nuclear submarine, the greatest in the world, right off their shores. So, I mean, it doesn't have to go 8,000 miles. And they're not playing games with us. We're not playing games with them either. We test missiles all the time. But, you know, we do have a submarine, a nuclear submarine. We don't need to go 8,000 miles. So I don't think it's an appropriate thing to Putin, for Putin to be saying either, by the way, you ought to get the war ended, says Trump. A war that should have taken 1 week is now in its soon 4th year. That's what you ought to do instead of testing missiles. Now, there are two very odd things about that. First of all, Trump was clearly briefed about the Burevestnik test, because when he's clearly briefed but doesn't very well understand, he repeats himself in a matter of seconds. Second, he's saying, we can threaten you whenever we like, and I'm not threatened. This is a game. And third, he seems to be saying, hurry up, Putin, and finish your war in the Ukraine. 3 things. Now, my Russian sources do believe that Trump has quietly implied or said, hurry up and finish your war. So Burevestnik seems to be a diversion between the two sides on saber-rattling, negotiations, and war fighting.
Yeah. John, when it comes to the tone of Donald Trump, that the Russian part, some people in Russia believe that he's talking about hurry up. What was that? I don't understand it. Maybe in the mind of those people in Washington that makes sense, but for Russians that doesn't make sense. What does that mean? It means Russia go and destroy all of Ukraine?
Well, it's perhaps later on we can come to the Trump's brain test and brain scans that were taken earlier this month at the Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, about which there's now some discussion why he had to have his brain scanned at all 2 weeks ago. So the issue of what Trump means when he says things and what Russia must do, we can go round and around. That's the food for lots and lots of podcasts. One could podcast 24 hours a day about what he means, or whether he himself is consistent in meaning. Do you mean to ask, what does the current Russian attitude or sentiment or interpretation of US policy after the Tomahawk threat, after the threat to authorize alternative missiles to the Tomahawk? They mean the Storm Shadow Scalp missile of the French and the British, and the Taurus missile of Germany, and then, of course, the tougher oil sanctions. Do you mean, how does Russia interpret those, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, that could be part of the answer, because in my opinion, Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be a failed state, totally failed state on its border. After all, let's face it, they're gonna have some sort of settlement after all in Ukraine. So what would Ukraine be in the aftermath of that sort of settlement? I think it's so much important to Russia, and because that could bring huge problems in terms of security, in terms of instability.
Yes. Well, it's a very important question that's not often asked, so thank you for asking it. How does the war end from a Russian point of view? How does the war end? It's one thing for all of our discussions and much of the mainstream and alternative media discussion to focus on the terms for a ceasefire, the terms for a peace settlement. But how does the war end from a Russian point of view? In many senses, it's important to say that that Trump's multi-stage form of threat, kill them dead, which is his language, threatening, attacks followed by ceasefires, followed by fake settlement arrangements. These are multi-stage, 1, 2, 3 stage of negotiation and threat and war making on Trump's part. Always end, when there's resistance, in a third stage war. But these wars don't end. The US is not intending to change its fundamental policy towards Russia. That's why the root cause of this conflict, as the Russian side keeps saying, will not be addressed by Trump. And the Russian side understands that particular attempt since 2021, since before the special military operation, to reach a mutual security pact with Europe and the United States. That's been put off for the future, beyond 2028, whoever is elected president. So in the short term, until 2028, what do the Russians see as an end of war? Well, let me quote you a source I asked that question of in the last 24 hours. Quotes, "The rate of east to west Ukrainian migration will accelerate, and there'll be a disintegration of the front line with a breakthrough on any one of the critical axes that will determine the entire Ukrainian defense east of the Dnieper River. The ouster of Zelensky and Yermak will follow when the Ukrainian commanders cannot order their forces to continue fighting or holding their ground. Of course, there will be Russian satisfaction with the new regional lines and the depth of the demilitarized zone westward to Kiev. Of course, and this is your point, Nima, Banderite terrorism, Ukrainian terrorism, Kiev regime terrorism will continue, but so will the electric war strikes, as well as assassinations from the Russian side in reply. the rump Ukraine will be dysfunctional to the point where day-to-day survival will trump war fighting in terms of allocation of resources. Now, that's Trump with a small t. It means defeat. Quotes, there's no need for the Russians to declare they're done fighting. The situation will speak for itself. The declaration that matters is that the winner is confident the opponent will never get up again. Now, I ask another source, what does never get up again mean? It means all of the Ukraine will be a DMZ, a demilitarized zone. So to the big question that you raised, does it become a terrorist state, a terrorist platform against Russia? Yes, it does, but that's a terrorist platform, a level of war fighting, which the Russian side believes it can contain if there's a deep enough DMZ. There must be no NATO bases, advisors, troops, or weapons installations. So the Ukraine would be disarmed to the point where it can have internal police level security, but not the capability to attack. We're speaking, and you asked what the Russian side thinks the end of war will be. There'll be a ceasefire to be monitored by neutral units along contact line, not NATO units. And there'll be eventually a Russia-US treaty to be negotiated by Putin and the president elected after 2028. That's the Russian idea of how the end of war would be. But it does go to your question, what would be the rump state? And the answer would be, it would be demilitarized, but not denazified.
Yeah. John, part of the current state of negotiations or the talks between the two sides, the Russian side and the West side, is the misunderstanding, or somehow they don't get each other. What is that? Because Donald Trump came out and said that there are lines in gas stations in Russia. People are in line, and which wasn't as I've learned from Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson was in Russia and he was filming some areas that he was in those areas, and he said that there is nothing of that sort as he perceived it in Russia, in Moscow. But when it comes to the larger understanding of NATO, of Trump administration, Europeans, do they really understand what is the conditions, what are the conditions in Russia today?
I'm pausing because you're asking, do they really understand? Is there an intelligence assessment? Do the principles of the NATO leadership understand? Does Trump himself understand that when they speak of the vulnerability of the Russian economy, do they actually believe the Russian economy is as vulnerable as they say? I believe they can't make a mistake about the Russian economic situation. I've explained myself that there have been gasoline shortages, especially in the Southwest. Larry Johnson did not leave Moscow, and what he saw in Moscow is not an effective description of the nature of the petrol shortages. These were real, and they caused an increase in petroleum product pricing. And they've been thoroughly admitted and thoroughly analyzed by the Russian press.
Sorry for interrupting you, John.
Yes.
It was because of those attacks, Ukrainian and NATO attacks on the infrastructure in Russia, or it was the outcome of something else?
Certainly, there's been some impact on refinery output. But in the Dances with Bears report I produced, it's clear that it was logistic problems, the problem of getting the fuel from the refineries. About 30% of refinery output was briefly, let's say from 7 to 14 days, suspended. In that period of time, there was a logistic problem of moving the fuel from the refineries producing it in surplus areas to deficit areas. So there was a gasoline shortage, particularly concentrated among independent gas stations or petrol stations, not on the mainstream large oil company gas stations, and not in Moscow. But there's been also of people taking advantage inside the industry and consumers. People, when you face that, and all of us are the same, you hoard, you stock up, and hoarding on the commercial side meant individuals, middlemen, exploiting spot shortages, regional shortages, southwest shortages in order to make bigger margins for selling petrol and gas and other fuels elsewhere. So all of those problems were real. One has to understand that Russia has the capacity to resolve its problems quickly, and it has and is resolving the gasoline shortage. It has to defend its refineries. So we can get onto it. The new sanction hits refineries. It hits approximately a third of the Russian refineries, the Rosneft refineries and the Lukoil refineries, in their export capability. And it hits petroleum products exports, especially not to Russia, not to China and India, though they're big buyers of petroleum products, but to Turkey. We can come back to that in a minute. Your question was, is the Russian economy vulnerable to war? And the answer is no. And the answer I've tried to explain in print is what the Russians say. The biggest damage, and this comes from Mikhail Delyagin, a major voice on economic policy in the State Duma, a former Yeltsin economist, one of the best and most critical of the opposition economists. Mikhail Delyagin is saying the biggest damage to the Russian economy is not coming from the war, or that's the drones, the drone attacks, or from the sanctions. It's come from Governor Nabiulna and the Russian central bank. Why? Because, and I don't believe Larry Johnson spoke of this, the Russian central bank has been running extraordinarily high interest rates, and Nabiulna has refused to reduce them. The most recent central bank rate cut, and it's come down from 22 to 20, and it was lowered to 16.5% on October the 24th. The current central bank policy is to reduce Russian economic growth to zero. Let me explain. And this is the damage to the Russian economy. And it's endorsed by the president and Kremlin. Let me read you what Nabiulna describes as the policy. I'm just reading you the Bank of Russia key rate cut statement of 24 of October. Quotes, the upward deviation of the Russian economy from a balanced growth path is narrowing. That's what is meant by zero growth. Zero growth. And she's announced that there are one-off factors causing the inflation against which she maintains these crushingly high investment stopping interest rates. One is one-off factors increase motor fuel prices. There's no doubt the central bank recognizes shortage, inflationary expectations of the gas pump. She also recognizes that inflation is being driven by the state, by the increase in the VAT from 20% to 22%. These are war taxes, if you like, but the impact of crushing the economy to zero is coming from the central bank. And in this, I'm turning the page on this statement. Nabiullina's statement says is essentially she's against the continuation of the war. One of the inflation drivers, she says, is deterioration in the terms of external trade. That's the central banker way of saying US and European sanctions are causing disruption of the terms of external trade. In other words, the central bank is acting to reinforce the external threats. And in this new statement, I'm reaching for various bits of paper in which she says it. She's saying in 2026, we'll have the same level of central bank interest rate. Now, every significant business voice and consumers too object to this level of central bank interest, but President Putin has continued to defend her. And she insists that this 50 basis points cut of this past week will be all she'll do, because next year she aims at maintaining this very high interest rate. And that's the principle, as to go back to Del Yagan's statement, the principal threat to the Russian economy. Do the NATO powers, does the United States understand these are self-inflicted wounds which can be changed, which aren't responsive to their war making? They probably do, but they certainly don't say so.
John, you've mentioned the situation with Turkey. It's not just about Turkey. The pressure from the United States on Hungary, Turkey. They're talking about Croatia, and it's the way. It's not just about. They were talking about China and India. It seems that these are two big, giant countries that is so much difficult for the United States to put a lot of pressure on them without having some sort of repercussions in their economy. But when it comes to the countries like Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia, and these countries, how can they, put pressure on them? Before going to that, here is what Matt Whitaker, the U.S. ambassador to NATO said about that. What he said on Fox News.
Our expectation is that countries like Hungary, Turkey, and Slovakia that continue to buy Russian oil and gas will come up with a plan and execute a plan that weans them off of Russian oil and gas. And Hungary, unlike many of their neighbors, has not made any plans or made any active steps. And so we're going to continue to work with them, and we're going to continue to work with their neighbors like Croatia and other countries that can help them wean themselves off. And, obviously that pipeline is most likely to be shut off in the coming years as well. And so there's a lot of planning that our friends in Hungary should do. And we're going to help them, obviously, as a good ally, make those plans and execute them to get them off of Russian oil and gas.
So how far would the West, or let's put it this way, the Trump administration would go in that direction to put pressure on them?
As far as they think that they can, as far as they are currently attempting to do. It's one issue to talk up the threats. The Croatia problem is serious for Serbia because Serbia has been sanctioned through the secondary sanctions with the US to block its oil and gas companies, state companies, from buying from Gazprom. And so let's go back. There was, to some extent, the reaction to the US oil sanction of saying it's an unserious one. And one of the podcasters I heard say that it's unserious and ineffectual because it sanctions Rosneft and Lukoil's assets in the United States. Since those companies don't have significant assets in the United States, the sanction is tokenism, not real. This is to misunderstand that the sanctions, the oil sanction against Rosneft and Lukoil, has its bite at the secondary level, and you mentioned it. China and India are the principal buyers of crude oil, and they're the targets of the US sanction to cut off, as Ambassador Whitaker just said, to cut off Russian oil and gas trade, or in this case, oil trade, with its principal buyers of crude, which are China, India, then a very small amounts by the EU, Turkey, and finally a tiny amount from Myanmar. But the oil products trade is different. Turkey's the principal buyer of Russian oil products. That's jet fuel, gasoline, diesel, mazout, boiler fuel, and so forth, and bunkers for ships. Turkey's the principal importer of oil products, followed by China, Brazil, and I'm reading from a report of June, July. China, Brazil, India, Singapore, which re-exports Russian oil products, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. They're all targets. And as Whitaker just said, our aim is to destroy Russia's capacity to trade. Destroy it. That brings us to the level of warfare with Russia that's comparable to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's July and August 1941 sanctions on Japan. The first sanction, July 26, 1941, froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Let's call that comparable to the freeze of Russian state assets, the 300 billion euro worth or dollar worth freeze of 2022, immediately after the SVO started. Now we have an attempt to cut off in its entirety all Russian exports of oil and petroleum products. Now, that's serious. It's not unserious. It's as serious as FDR's attack on Japanese oil. Different circumstance. The Japanese were oil dependent on oil imports, but Russia is oil export dependent. Let me say that the market, first of all, the market doesn't think this is going to work, and that's the important thing. So I've put on the Dances with Bears for the audience to watch the charts. Since it's serious, the question is, how does the market for oil futures react? And do they expect a shortage of supply, which would drive up price? Now, when President Putin was asked to respond to Trump's oil sanction, he made this point. If you like, we can quote him, but essentially saying, I've explained to Trump that if you do this sort of thing, what you will do is curb the supply of oil and oil products into the market when there's no alternative source of supply. If you shorten supply while demand remains constant or even increasing or even decreases a little, either way, you disjoin the relationship between supply and demand, and you will trigger price rises. Putin clearly said, I warned Trump, if you disrupt the market this way, your car drivers will get sharply increased gasoline prices. And aren't you going into election next year? You want gasoline price inflation in the United States as you run for election. That will have serious consequences for you. So Putin has clearly explained that. The market, on the other hand, and I've provided the charts, I won't hold them up, essentially is reacted the following way. There was a 3-day price jump for oil futures for West Texas Intermediate, that's the US oil benchmark, and Brent crude both of them, the WTI went up, and I'm looking at my charts. It initially went up about 10 to 12% in 3 days, but then it's reversed and corrected. As of this morning, WTI crude was trading at 6.3% above its October 20, the pre-sanctions level. So the market thinks that for WTI crude oil, it's a limited supply disruption. Brent crude went up approximately 12% in the first 3 days and is down to 6.5% now. Urals crude, which is the Russian blend that's exported, went up 11% in the first 3 days, and it hasn't corrected yet. Now, what is the market saying? The market's saying you will fail to stop the trade. So I asked my sources to explain that, and I'll just quote you what a Russian oil trade source has told me from Dubai. Quotes, "There's no way to stop the oil. You only add more ship-to-ship transfers and add some more percentage to the middlemen, and off it goes." The point is that while everyone, he means everyone in Russia, is fixed on the Russian central bank interest rates, you in fact have state and private oil companies and the whole system acting more secretively than ever. The new sanction does not stop the oil moving into money. It just makes it more difficult, and that means more dollars per barrel for the middlemen. In Moscow business, banking, economic, and political circles, there's confidence that the 10 percentage points everyone's been making on oil deal making off the books will continue. That's the Trump effect. We Russians aren't ungrateful for it. In other words, what the oil sanction does is increase black oil trading. And while you could discount this kind of trader excessive confidence, you might say, there's no discounting the market numbers. People who have to make a daily living speculating on what the price of oil will be out 3 months, out 6 months, believe it will be very small. Why? Because they agree the trade will become blacker, and Ambassador Whitaker can say whatever he likes. He's waving his hands at the sea rolling in. The sea of oil will continue to roll. And these Americans who think they can control that sea and force it to roll back are false and faking and have an ambition they lack the power to implement.
How do you connect the situation with oil and with what's going on between the United States and Venezuela? Because the situation is getting critical, John. And even let's assume that the United States can do something in Venezuela. Bringing Venezuela to the market, it's going to take time. It's not going to be tomorrow and in 2 months and 3 months. It's going to take time. How can we understand that? It seems that if they go in that direction, it seems to me that they have a long-term strategy in fighting Russia. That would be the end game. Fighting and the continuation of the conflict, as Zelensky is talking about. He's planning for the next 3 years to come to fight Russia.
Yes.
You're taking that.
I agree with you, Nima. They're all of the same pattern, but at different stages of war making. Now, let me make a general point, then let's come to the Venezuelan issue. It's very important we talk about Venezuela. For every one of Trump's, 8, 9, or 10 so-called peacemaking moves, as he counts them, there's been a Trump war-making move, okay? And these have basically, I think we can say, 3 stages. First, Trump starts with a kill them dead talk. And his statement that about so-called Venezuelan drug smugglers, which we'll come back to in a minute, is a complete lie, was we kill them dead. We kill them dead. He said it. That's the sort of talk which, when combined with sanctions, attacks on economic sectors like the Venezuelan capability to export oil, they're called sanctions against an enemy. They're called tariffs when they're applied to neutral or allied states. At that stage, Trump's war is essentially trying to trigger a domestic surrender, led by a fifth column of politicians or businesses or government and security agencies, generals and policemen, which have been cultivated over the years by the Central Intelligence Agency or the State Department, the Pentagon. And the fifth column has to be mobilized first. We saw it as Israel and Mossad tried to do for regime change in Iran at the beginning of the June war. What happened, we've seen in Venezuela. You have first the Guaido candidacy opposed to the elected government. And now we have the Nobel Prize winning woman, Machado. These are the fifth columnists established by the United States inside Iran or Venezuela or whatever the target may be that Russia's had its Alexei Navalny and others. The fifth column approach combined with kill them dead talk combined with economic sanctions is Trump's first war-making stage. Second war-making stage happens when the fifth column candidates fail to mobilize effectively, as was the case with Guaido. What happens with effective resistance is negotiations. Trump then sends out special emissaries. It was Richard Grenell in Venezuela. It was Stephen Witkoff with Iran. It's been Stephen Witkoff with Russia. It was Kushner and Witkoff with Israel and Gaza. These special emissaries then combine bribes, threats of more violence, and try to develop a term sheet on which this so-called peace can be arranged. When that fails, when resistance to the American negotiating terms proves solid, as it has been everywhere, including Iran, Venezuela, Hamas, and Russia, of course, China and India, of course, North Korea, of course, when the resistance proves too strong, Trump has a problem. And he solves the problem either by escalating to a massive violent strike, as he used against Iran, or a buildup of preparation for violence, as he's using against Venezuela right now as we speak, or he retreats. He retreats under cover of a smokescreen of one kind or another. Ceasefire is one of the smokescreens he's used in these various war-making stages in the past. So let's go then back to where at stage 3 Trump war-making with Venezuela. What's really happening? Well, we know that Admiral Horsley, the commander of operations in Venezuela, has resigned rather than proceed to command what, and he hasn't said it, but you've had podcasters explain it, and it's true. Horsley believed, as do many U.S. generals in command, that the commander-in-chief's orders are illegal and unconstitutional. And Horsley's had the bravery to resign. You recall, and we talked about it last time, President Trump ordered 800 of these general staff officers to assemble in front of him and said, if you don't want to obey, you can leave the room. And Horsley didn't leave the room, but he did later. So where are we? To date, as I've counted it, there have been 9 separate military strikes by US drones or missiles on supposed Venezuelan drug runners. The war against drugs isn't a new war against a target in the United States. I wrote a book 50 years ago about the wars against drugs since 1880 and 90 in California. Nothing new there. This time, the drug war is a camouflage, a smokescreen for regime change in Venezuela. Everybody listening understands that. But the attacks themselves, and Trump has shown off the video of hitting a speedboat or an alleged submarine and blowing it up. None of them have been identified with any exact geographical coordinates. We know at least 2 of the 9 occurred in the Pacific Ocean. Now, Venezuela doesn't have a Pacific coastline. So there's no reliable mapping to show that the people on board were in Venezuelan waters as claimed. I'm just flipping my page to look at a couple of maps that I've put up on the website. So investigative reporting, which is principally Spanish media, not the US media, not even the alternative media in the United States, have come up with the evidence. But the evidence is there's no evidence of drug smuggling, drug cargoes, or the capacity of these speedboats to move any cargo 1,000 nautical miles north to the nearest Florida coastline. So the claim that they represented the United States is a lie. It's a fake. What we do know, and it's very interesting, from the 2 survivors of the October 16 so-called submarine strike, were their nationality. One of them, a man called Andres Fernando Tufino, is Ecuadorian, and he's been sent back. He's lucky he wasn't killed on board the US ship that rescued him, or killed in the water, because he provides evidence that he wasn't in Venezuelan waters and wasn't part of any kind of Venezuelan scheme. Of course, Ecuadorians, including his family, and CNN, to its credit, has published an interview with his sister, claims he was a simple fisherman. Well, simple fishermen don't get paid very much in these countries and may very well carry cargoes that are contraband. Cornwall, as a county in England, had several hundred years of living off contraband. Is there a drug threat from Venezuela, from Mr. Tufino? No, there wasn't. Was he acting with Ecuadorian or Colombian drug smugglers towards the United States? Maybe he was, but he was not Venezuelan. The other survivor was Colombian, a man called Obando Perez. He's been repatriated to Colombia in serious physical condition, but there's no evidence that either of them were either Venezuelan in origin or attacked in Venezuelan waters, or represented what Trump is using as his case for war against Venezuela. So even if one went to the trouble of doing more than I've just quoted you, based on El País and other media investigations, showed that Trump is a liar. Trump is faking. What's new about Russia, of the United States going to war against countries with fakes? After all, Lyndon Baines Johnson fabricated the so-called Vietnamese attack on a US warship in the Gulf of Tonkin in order to justify the so-called surge into Vietnam that began the major Vietnam War operations, in which the Vietnamese resistance, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, defeated the US army. So that we have reached stage 3 with Venezuela. And the question is, will they be able to defend themselves against the kinds of attacks that will come? And what will come? Is it a massive show of strength in order to frighten the Venezuelan people, but will not be used to attack? That's a possibility, and where Trump would try to mobilize Mrs. Machado to have some form of internal disruption, protest, trigger some demonstration casualties, self-inflicted possibly if Maduro's police don't open fire, but agitators working for the CIA do, and we've seen that, is a Maidan type provocation to occur. If that were to occur, we could very well understand the American script. Mrs. Machado may be wounded, others may be killed, and she will appeal for US intervention to save lives. And then we can imagine Trump announcing to the American people and the world, he's intervening to save lives. And that's what might happen. The question then is whether the two principal powers supporting the Venezuelan economy, China, which is the heaviest foreign investor in Venezuela and the major recipient of Venezuelan oil, and Russia, will enable and help Maduro first to deter such an American air intervention, the dropping of special forces and so forth, to deter it or to combat it. Because were Trump to pull such an intervention, would Trump be facing a Bay of Pigs? And that's where we have to remind everybody, the one thing Trump thinks in his three-stage war making is that he can demonstrate such a power to obliterate, his word applied to Iran, that he can achieve peace through war. But the one thing that curbs that ambition is the prospect of losing, the prospect of facing casualties, the prospect that a US aircraft will be downed, that a Marine or special forces or commando landing in Venezuela will be met by unexpectedly heavy defense that wipes them out, a Bay of Pigs. Can President Trump risk with Venezuela a Bay of Pigs? A Bay of Pigs could be resisted by John F. Kennedy, though he himself didn't last very long after it. But Trump could not. A defeat of the Bay of Pigs type on a Venezuelan shore would be dramatically damaging to the Trump regime and to its entire three-stage war-making, means peacemaking ideology.
Yeah. John, we've learned that a Russian aircraft previously linked to Wagner Group and arrived in Venezuela, which would bring some sort of question. What is Russia doing in Venezuela? Or if Venezuela is receiving some sort of aid from China, Russia, maybe Iran. And do you think, when looking at this global South and their reaction to what's going on in Venezuela, do you think they reacting in a proper way?
Proper. The world has lost propriety. We're at war, as you've said, throughout the global South, in Europe and in the Far East, because there's no end to these three-stage Trump wars mean peace operations. Call them imperialism for short. I have published, for our audience to follow up if they wish, an account of Russian relations with the Maduro regime, the Maduro government, and before that, the Chavez government. The I've looked at the terminology of commitments in the Russian-Venezuelan Strategic Partnership Agreement, which has just been ratified by the Russian side. It was ratified a month or so ago on the Venezuelan side and signed earlier this year. Mr. Maduro was one of the guests at the May 9 Red Square military parade. There's a reluctance on the part of the Russian side and an even bigger reluctance on the part of the Chinese side to explicitly take Venezuela's side in defense against the United States. And our audience may have better documentation than I have for tonight or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, of Chinese statements in support of Venezuela under attack, but I haven't seen any. That doesn't mean that secretly, quietly, both the big powers and other smaller powers with much greater capabilities of resistance, like Iran, aren't doing what they can. The issue remains secrecy, and I have to say, I don't myself know. The issue for the United States is, what do their intelligence capabilities tell them about the rising defense capability of Venezuela to inflict a level of casualties which the United States cannot accept, a Bay of Pigs possibility. I don't know the answer to that either. What President Putin is intent on doing is trying to resolve the third stage war fighting threats from Trump right now, and trying to hold as much third world BRICS support for understanding his attempts to negotiate a second stage settlement with Trump have failed. And as they fail, the Russian side has to demonstrate its goodwill in seeking to defend itself. It is acting in all sorts of ways to support Iran quietly. There is a, let's call it, more explicit strategic partnership with Iran, but not as explicit in mutual defense as there is between Russia and North Korea. That's the strongest. An attack on one is an attack on the other. Article 5 of the NATO pact type, one for all for one security arrangement. That exists between Russia and North Korea, but hasn't been tested yet. It does not exist on the surface, on the papers, with Iran, but it is being tested to a level of Russian deterrent capability against Israel and another form of US attack. Is it being developed very quietly and secretly with Venezuela? I don't know.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me, Nima. See you next week.
See you.